At the beginning of the 1800s, reports from newly explored parts of the world amazed the European and American public. No discovery was too incredible. Anything seemed possible. As news of Egypt's wealth of wonders began to circulate, the fascination for all things Egyptian became insatiable.
There was a feeling that the hieroglyphs contained secrets about the gods, the universe, astronomy, that were simply not known to ordinary people. There was curiosity right from the start because the things are so obvious and so pictorial, and above all because they've been associated with the temples, the priesthood. There was a feeling that they had to contain mysteries, that hieroglyphs weren't just ordinary writing, that there you had a civilization that if only you could crack the mystery would tell us things that nobody had ever thought of.
And now, with the key to the Egyptian language in hand, all eyes turned towards the decoding of the Rosetta Stone. After arriving in London in 1802, copies of the Rosetta Stone's text began to spread to universities throughout Europe. The deciphering race was beginning to develop into the world's greatest detective mystery. Its answers were destined to change our views on religion, science, and history. How would our beliefs in the Bible be affected? What magical medicines and technologies were going to be discovered? How did such an advanced civilization perish? As language specialists first began to study the relationship between the three scripts, no clear pattern was evident. The broken stone seemed to prevent any ability to match words and sentences. Not one hieroglyphic word or phrase could be positively identified. How was this seemingly impossible task going to be accomplished? What should their first steps be? Desperate for any clues, scholars dug into the past for help. The earliest account of the Egyptian language is a Greek book written by Horapollo. Said to be an Egyptian priest, he wrote extensively on the usage and meaning of the hieroglyphs. His 5th century BC book, Hieroglyphica, became the cornerstone of future beliefs. Horapollo wrote of 189 different hieroglyphic signs. With each one, he detailed their description and mythological meaning. While he discussed specifics on individual signs, Horapollo never combined them to form sentences or paragraphs. While many of his findings were correct, his work also contained errors.
Horapollo tells us things that actually are true, but he tells us things for quite the wrong reason. So he says, for example, that in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the word for mother is written with a vulture. That happens to be true. But he then explains that in nature, there are no male vultures. All vultures are female. And there's a great mystery here. Now, later on, as people started to look at the natural world and spotted indeed that there were vultures that were male and female, poor old Horapollo got discredited. So the truth he was telling us got thrown out with the mystical verbiage that he dressed it in.
Scholars attempting to decipher the Rosetta Stone also consulted historians' findings from the Middle Ages. As Europe entered its Renaissance, religious influence supported the idea that the hieroglyphs held answers to biblical mysteries.
People start to interpret ancient Egypt entirely through the Bible. So they look at the pyramids and say, the pyramids are not just ordinary tombs for ordinary kings. They are the granaries that Joseph, in the Bible, put up to collect the grain during the 7 good years in preparation for the 7 years of famine that were going to follow. So the mystery is kept, but it's always filtered through the idea that it reflects a story in the Bible.
Scholars also reviewed the work of German mathematics professor Athanasius Kircher. He became the recognized authority on hieroglyphs during the mid-1600s. Like Horapollo before him, Kircher described each hieroglyph as representing an idea or concept. Unlike Horapollo, Kircher began to combine them into words and phrases. Furthermore, Kircher simply made up imaginary translations. His fanciful readings led even the Pope to believe he could actually read the Egyptian language. Over a century later, at the time of Napoleon's expedition, Kircher's studies were still widely held as true. What the first scholars attempting to decipher the Rosetta Stone found in past fact and fiction was the commonly held belief that hieroglyphs were pictorial, similar to Oriental character writing. Each hieroglyph represented a word or idea. It wasn't until these past theories were abandoned that the Rosetta Stone would finally reveal its clues. In 1802, Sylvestre de Sacy of France and Johann Åkerblad of Sweden were the first to throw out the ideas of the past and try a fresh approach.
They looked at Egyptian hieroglyphs and said, other civilizations write in perfectly normal ways. I don't see why the Egyptians have to be different. They looked also at other documents from Egypt, not simply temples and obelisks and hieroglyphs, but things on papyrus, paper documents. And they said rightly, look, the Egyptians have perfectly good ways of writing perfectly ordinary, everyday letters. Maybe all of their writing system is rational after all.
De Sacy and Åkerblad followed the premise that the demonic language used a Western system of writing. They took a number of recurring Greek words, including the pronouns he or his, and the word Greek. They then searched the demonic text for words which repeated in roughly the same locations. They verified that wherever these words occurred in Greek, they appeared in a similar pattern in the demonic.
What these pioneers did was to begin to prove that the script was not just a symbolic script, that there were signs that meant individual letters, stood for individual letters. You no longer looked at it as something esoteric and full of hidden meaning.
Although their first step at translating the demonic text was somewhat promising, De Sacy and Åkerblad gave up, having failed to crack the hieroglyphic code. 3 years after the Rosetta Stone's discovery, opening the window onto Egypt's secrets was proving to be far more complex than anyone had thought. The greatest minds of Europe were beginning to think the mysteries of Egypt would stay hidden forever. Following De Sacy and Åkerblad's attempt, more than a decade passed without any further serious efforts. Although the public's fascination with ancient Egypt continued to grow, the Rosetta Stone was all but forgotten. For those thinking of trying to decipher the hieroglyphs, the failure of De Sacy and Åkerblad proved an intimidating legacy.
There was a feeling, as with most decipherments, that it's a big prize but also a big risk. You could end up covering yourself with glory, and you could end up making a really big fool of yourself. Now, scholars are by temperament rather cautious, and it takes a certain kind of person to say, I don't care if I make a fool of myself, I'm going to have a go at this.
Up next, the race heats up again as a wealthy scientist from England battles a young, obsessed French scholar to find the key. Meet the British genius who decided to spend his summer vacation decoding the Rosetta Stone. How did he become the first to read the hieroglyphs? Also, discover the legend surrounding a sorcerer's prediction that a small-town boy would be the one to bring light to the past.